Welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So, you shared some really interesting sources with us. It looks like we're focusing on former President Trump's latest comments about trade talks with China.
That's right. We've got a mixed news reports, some analysis digging into why he might be saying these things, and even takes from big names in business.
Okay. And our mission here, as always, is to kind of cut through the noise, right? Give our listeners a clear picture of what's actually happening with U.S.-China trade and, why it matters.
Exactly. It's messy, but important to track.
So let's start with Trump's statement. This was April 9th. He claimed China wants a deal but doesn't know how.
Yeah, that was the claim. But what's striking is how fast and how firmly Beijing responded.
Yeah.
Literally the same day and the day after.
Oh, really? What did they say?
Well, the foreign ministry spokesperson, Lin Jian, basically called the U.S. tariffs hegemonic bullying. Pretty strong language.
Wow. Okay. No holding back there.
Not at all. And he stressed that any real talks have to be based on equality and mutual respect. Completely different tone from Trump's comments.
So a total mismatch in rhetoric.
A chasm, really. And it immediately flags potential issues, right?
Yeah.
Breakdown in trust, maybe miscalculations.
And you mentioned the Commerce Ministry, too. They put out a white paper.
They did.
Oh.
And it reinforces that message. They point the finger at rising U.S. unilateralism, protectionism, saying China's own tariffs were a forced response.
So they're positioning themselves as reacting, not initiating.
Precisely. They underline that nobody wins a trade war. But, and this is key, while they don't want one, they are absolutely ready to respond if things escalate further.
It sounds less like diplomatic niceties and more like drawing a line in the sand.
I think that's a fair assessment. It points to a real fundamental disagreement on how international trade should even work.
Which brings us to the big question. Why the difference? Why would Trump say they're eager if they're pushing back so hard?
Okay, so the discussion summary you shared offers a pretty compelling theory on this.
Let's hear it.
It suggests Trump's statement might be, well, a deliberate lie.
A lie. To what end?
To pacify the U.S. financial markets. Basically, to prevent a negative reaction on Wall Street.
Interesting. Does the summary connect that to anything else?
It does. It mentions Treasury Secretary Benson had claimed just a few days earlier on April 6th that over 50 countries, including China, were seeking negotiations.
Ah, okay. So Trump's comment is maybe trying to reinforce that narrative, keep the markets calm, project strength, even if it's not quite the reality.
That's the argument. It paints a picture of a deliberate tactic, trying to look in control.
It sounds like that classic create problems then solve them approach the source mentions.
Exactly. But the source also points out that China's first and immediate, comprehensive, and sharp counterattack, as they put it.
That strong pushback we just talked about.
Right. It suggests this tariff war isn't quite going according to that old playbook. China didn't just roll over.
So maybe an overconfidence, a miscalculation of China's reaction.
That seems to be the implication, that this strategy of extreme pressure isn't yielding the expected results, at least not immediately.
Does the source suggest what we should watch for now?
Yeah, it gives a couple of markers.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on the U.S. financial market stability over the next, say, 3 to 6 months.
Okay.
If it stays volatile, despite the confident talk, it might signal that people are starting to see this less as just extreme strategic blackmail.
And more as something causing real economic harm.
Exactly. A shift in perception could be significant.
This seems like a good point to bring in the business leaders. You mentioned Elon Musk and Bill Ackman.
Yes. Their perspectives add another important dimension. Musk, running Tesla with its huge China footprint.
Right, he's got skin in the game. Big time.
He's reportedly urged Trump personally to rethink the tariffs. He understands China's strength and, what a trade war could do to Tesla. It's a very direct commercial reality for him.
And Ackman. He's coming from the investment side, right?
Right, a major investor. He was quite vocal on social media around April 6th. He basically tweeted that the U.S. is launching a trade war against the whole world.
Strong words again.
Very. He warned it was damaging international business confidence in the U.S. So you have Musk focused on the operational side, Ackman on investor sentiment.
But both pointing to damage. Damage to the real economy and the virtual one, the markets.
That's the convergence, yes. They see these policies as harmful across the board.
Let's circle back to China's strong initial response. The discussion summary made a really interesting point about why that was so important.
It did. It argued that if China hadn't pushed back so hard right away,
other countries might have joined the U.S., like the EU maybe.
That's the concern raised, yes. It could have created a scenario where the EU and others followed the U.S. lead, impose their own tariffs, and then China would look isolated, maybe painted as the difficult one.
The source even made a historical comparison, didn't it? Something about appeasement.
It alluded to it, yeah. The idea being that compromising here might have been seen as weakness, not goodwill. It could have just invited more pressure down the line.
So in this kind of non-traditional security context, like trade, a soft response wasn't really an option.
The argument is that a step-by-step gradual response might not have sent a strong enough signal. Trump's approach, the source suggests, is about negotiating from perceived strength, leaving very little room for China to give ground without looking like they're caving.
Okay, that makes sense. What about other players, the EU specifically? You mentioned that call between the Chinese leader and Ursula von der Leyen.
Yes, that was April 8th. Really interesting timing.
What came out of that?
Well, officially, it was about the 50th anniversary of China-EU relations.
Yeah.
Lots of talk about political trust, practical cooperation, solving issues through dialogue.
Standard diplomatic stuff.
Standard stuff, but also a clear emphasis on safeguarding free and open trade.
So a subtle counterpoint to the U.S. approach.
Maybe not so subtle. The summary highlights von der Leyen specifically commenting on how U.S. tariffs have severely impacted international trade.
Oh, okay. So she called it out directly.
According to the summary, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it mentioned a shared commitment between the EU and China to the multilateral trading system, the very system the U.S. tariffs are seen as undermining.
So potential alignment there based on shared concern.
Definitely a point of shared concern. The source talks about the EU having a kind of bystander mentality in this specific U.S.-China fight.
And China welcomes that.
Apparently, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The logic is the more major players stay on the sidelines.
The more the U.S. action looks unilateral.
Exactly. It makes the U.S. position look less like a global consensus and maybe highlights that outward show of strength but inward weakness the source mentions. If other big economies aren't jumping on board, it raises questions.
And this could influence other countries too, like Malaysia.
That's the suggestion. Countries watching this might see China resisting U.S. pressure effectively and start, weighing the economic benefits of closer ties with Beijing versus aligning with Washington.
Making China seem like a power to be reckoned with, or in awe of, as the source puts it.
That's the phrasing used, yes. That a firm stance can actually build respect, maybe even shift geopolitical calculations for some nations.
The discussion then pivots to this idea of a tariff anti-China alliance. Kind of a Western-led WTO v2.0.
Right, that's how the source frames it. But it immediately contrasts that idea with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
That's the big Asia-Pacific trade deal signed in 2020, right? 15 countries.
Correct. And the source emphasizes the strategic location of these countries, mostly surrounding China. Plus, things like the China-Laos Railway are boosting confidence in RCEP's future.
So RCEP is presented as a counterweight or an alternative model.
Potentially much more than that. Its influence isn't just internal. It could pull global supply chains more towards the RCEP region and especially towards China.
This reminds me of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Exactly. The source makes that link explicitly. It mentions former Treasury Secretary Mnuchin saying back in 2018 that the U.S. might rejoin TPP or its successor, CPTPP.
So the current tariff situation is maybe just another version of trying to create a U.S.-led economic bloc aimed at China.
That's the argument. It connects it to this idea of a financial firewall.
A firewall, meaning?
Using trade deals like TPP as a non-traditional security tool to essentially exclude China from key parts of the global economy, to force China to sort of re-enter the WTO, but on new terms more favorable to the U.S.
But that strategy hasn't really worked out as planned, has it?
It seems stalled, yes. Which leads the source to pose a really interesting question.
Which is?
If the U.S. plan was a kind of WTO v2.0 without China, is RCEP effectively becoming a WTO v2.0 with China right at the center?
Wow, that's a big thought, given the size of the RCEP economies.
It's a plausible interpretation, for sure.
So, going back to that von der Leyen call, maybe they weren't just talking pleasantries. Could they have been discussing, say, EU-China cooperation within RCEP, or how to jointly push back on U.S. tariffs?
The source definitely speculates along those lines. It suggests RCEP's growing strength might even empower its members to demand better terms from the U.S., maybe even force the U.S. to negotiate access to RCEP markets eventually.
It really brings home the point about China's market itself being a source of power.
Absolutely crucial point.
Yeah.
The source calls China the world's largest, most stable, most mature market. Think about U.S. chip companies.
They need the Chinese market.
Desperately. The source argues market access is like the provisions in an economic war,
Yeah.
maybe more vital than technology or capital.
Yeah.
Whoever controls access holds significant power.
And disrupting that access, like through tariffs.
It doesn't just hurt bilateral business, it messes with global trade flows, and it potentially undermines the US dollar's dominance if people start looking for alternatives.
Like the RMB, promoting the yuan.
It could certainly incentivize the international community to explore that more seriously, yes.
Okay, this is a lot on the economic and trade front, but the sources also connect this to, well, traditional security, military matters.
They do. It shifts focus near the end to that announcement from the Dalian Maritime Bureau about military exercises in the Bohai Sea, also on April 9th.
Same day as Trump's comment and the initial Chinese response. Interesting timing.
Very. The source explicitly links the tariff war, the non-traditional security conflict, to potential spillover into the traditional security realm.
How so?
It brings up the Taiwan issue. The argument presented is that Taiwan isn't just a card the U.S. can play whenever it wants anymore.
Meaning?
Meaning the timing of any potential reunification is becoming more influenced by the wider international situation, not just U.S. policy. And it raises the possibility, under certain circumstances, of China initiating a bottom-line plan regarding Taiwan.
A plan that could also aim to reduce the U.S. dollar's influence in East Asia.
That's part of the suggested scenario, yes. It's presented as a potential contingency, not necessarily imminent, but linked to these broader tensions.
And the source questions whether the U.S. just printing more money would work in that kind of scenario, this red giant effect.
It expresses doubt about that, yes, suggesting that overwhelming financial might isn't always the trump card, especially against coordinated pushback or fundamental shifts.
So the Bohai Sea exercises, maybe they're more than routine.
The source speculates they could be a signal, a display of heavy weapons, maybe hinting at advanced capabilities like the Type 096 submarine or the JL-3 missile.
A warning shot, essentially.
A strong warning, perhaps, a signal to the U.S. not to push things too far, not to risk a complete breakdown of the current global order.
Okay, so wrapping this all up for our listeners, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, first, there's a strong suggestion, based on the analysis, that recent U.S. claims about China wanting a deal might be strategically misleading, likely aimed at calming markets.
Right. A disconnect between rhetoric and reality.
Second, there's significant global pushback, or at least hesitation, regarding U.S. tariff policies. Key players like the EU aren't fully on board.
Or bystander effect.
Exactly. Third, powerful alternative structures like RCEP are emerging and gaining influence, potentially reshaping global trade dynamics with China at the center.
A potential WTO v 2.0, but different from the U.S. vision.
And finally, these economic tensions don't exist in a vacuum. There's a clear potential for them to intersect with and possibly escalate traditional security concerns, particularly in the Asia-Pacific.
It's a really complex picture, which leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. Given everything we've just unpacked, the conflicting narratives, the market plays, the shifting alliances, the security undertones, what major long-term shifts do you see coming in the global economic and political landscape?
Yeah, think about how international trade might evolve. Who will the key global powers be, and how will their influence change? What new economic alliances might form?
Lots to chew on there. Hopefully this deep dive gives you a solid starting point for thinking through these huge unfolding issues.